Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back with some more market updates, some interesting moves this week. The GDT 365 and chart of the week from you this time around.
Let's see how it goes. So some pretty dynamic changes, like a big week really in terms of market shifts, mostly downwards. Some big action on the European FATS market, and we've seen, since last Thursday, futures markets dropping significantly, and several things coming together here. Reading local commentary, there's a lot of wringing of hands and what's caused all this, how could this happen, and what's it all about. I mean, very high prices tend to cure very high prices, and sometimes quickly. Several things are coming together. We've seen signals that there's more milk coming. Cream demand is bound to be slowing when you look at the weather maps and how temperatures have cooled, and certainly buyers pushing back on pretty high prices. So the most interesting thing is hearing the chorus of saying this was unforeseen. I think that's remarkable, really, when you think about just how high we've been for so long, particularly when you look at this chart, which shows, really we haven't seen things shift much since late August, bouncing around at top, certainly pushing new boundaries, but these are the December and March contracts. But obviously the shorter term's been stronger because there's been a lot of buyers uncovered and kept coming, really, and kept the bid strong. Eventually it's got to run out.
Sure.
Across to the US, where there's also been weeks of declining butter prices, mostly in the short term, mostly spot and near-term futures. But again, abundant cream supplies, pretty comfortable stocks got reported last week. We don't have detail of that here, but slowing demand. We're certainly seeing retail signals. The work that Phil Plord puts up, our colleague Phil Plord puts up in his weekly demand notes, showing that retail sales certainly slowed in the butter category. So all that's coming together as well. Not much change going into Q1, but certainly short-term correction. It's been seasonally quite early when you consider when butter usually falls away in the US, Joe. This is earlier than expected, so it could have a bit of a kick.
Sure. Yeah, and just going across to skim milk powder, AEX futures there just drifting a little bit weaker, nothing too startling there. In terms of the SGX futures, still, not much movement, an odd little bubble there in the second quarter of 2025 when Northern Hemisphere has a lot of product, so a little bit odd, but obviously not so much availability from Oceania. So could be an anomaly, we'll see. And just moving forward to whole milk powder futures, they moved up a little bit just in and around this GDT event this week. That will be certainly warming the hearts of Kiwi dairy producers, who also got a bit of a bump in their payout forecast from Fonterra last week. So very upbeat in New Zealand at the moment.
And promises in New Zealand also of higher dividends coming in the future too, with the unveiling of Fonterra's strategy update. They'll be feeling a bit chuffed.
And then just going across to cheese prices, US barrel spot market lost 18% in the last 2 weeks. So we saw it really rally up to record highs, and now it's just coming off. Blocks are off 7% for the same period. There are reports of some improvements in supply. There's really no change in the forward curve for cheese prices, but we would be watching the effect of weaker butter values in Europe. Does that stick, and how does it impact cheese prices? So lots of action in the futures area.
Over to GDT number 365.
Yeah, and Steve, it was overall, the price index was up 1.2%. And in the context, we got some pretty positive news out of New Zealand recently about their production prospects. So, in that context, that's a pretty good result. Demand was a little weaker. Whole milk powder was up 3.2%, importantly, given the weight of whole milk powder on the platform. Skim milk powder down just slightly, off 0.5%. Cheddar was up 4%, but that really brought it more into alignment with forward US markets. And there was a higher whole milk powder offering this time, Steve. So again, that's a pretty good result in that context.
It is. demand, Joe, how did that look?
Yeah, look, it was weaker across the board. You can just see that comparison there. AMF demand a bit stronger, but most things a little bit weaker, very much weaker for skim milk powder. But you've got some interesting demand charts on that, Steve, coming up.
Coming up.
Yeah.
So looking at what happened to the price curves and whole milk powder, as you said, like a good result given the volumes, the increase in volumes for the last event. We're nearly at the peak, obviously, but demand was weaker, but pretty good involvement again from China and Southeast Asia. And the Middle East also stayed in, just not enough of that demand to push it higher, but certainly that's flattened out that forward curve quite well. China stayed up, Joe.
Whole milk powder demand from China has been pretty consistent. We've seen them averaging around 10,000 tonnes for the last 4 events. So that's, again, the reason that we've got that good result for whole milk powder. Middle East also came back for a bit more whole milk powder. We've just talked about over the last weeks, pre-Ramadan stocking could still be going on. Good involvement from the Middle East as well.
We look at skim milk powder. Again, that line it didn't really change very much, drifted weaker in those forward contracts. And when we go to the event outcome, though, because you showed that earlier demand chart, that's the first 6 rounds in that chart. So that was a lot weaker. But this time they just stuck around. The buyers that came at the start they hung around for the bitter end, and it minimised the damage, I think, in the upshot, that it ended up quite a small result. Within the skim milk powder, though, we won't have charts on this, but the European prices fell. Oceania went up very slightly, but it was mostly about disappointing demand for the European offering, just in line with what we saw in their skim milk powder market earlier. Joe, over to skim milk powder buying.
Yeah, just looking at China's involvement, again, down on last week's record take for skim milk powder, but still up there in terms of where they've been in previous years. So again, pretty good support. Southeast Asia's skim milk powder demand also bounced back. Given that it was just a small fall in skim milk powder, that involvement in those regions was pretty good.
Joe, how's this result put the relative values?
Yeah, just looking at this synthetic whole milk powder value versus the whole milk powder, it's moved a little closer. Fats and skim milk powder just that little bit weaker at this event, and whole milk powder firming up. So just a bit more movement together. And in terms of skim milk powder, this is where we are for this event, still lower than what the futures markets are looking at there, but the futures are fairly well bunched together for most of the forward curve.
And these lines have come together a bit. It's that much lower European curve and not a lot of change in the Oceania numbers, but the rest of the pack are all together, aren't they?
They sure are. And Steve, this week it's your chart of the week.
I am honoured to have this opportunity, Joe. And I've never done the chart of the week, I don't think.
Don't mess it up.
Okay, so we're talking about China's stimulus and the consequence of this. A lot of questions being asked: what's this going to mean for imports? And is this going to change the world market or improve the demand side? So stimulus has come out in several different groups. We've had that general monetary support, which was announced earlier, greater access to finance, lower interest rates, etc., making it easier for people to borrow money short term, put it into working capital, etc. Then there's some promotional stimulus efforts, which have included many announcements like schools programs there and direct family subsidies to help young families cope with living costs. That will certainly help. And then some direct consumer support, including vouchers, and that's regionalised, so regions have different approaches. And also some announcements of support for small dairy producers. So it's hard to actually wrap all this up and say, here's a summary of what's being spent on what program, because it does come out at different times and not a lot of it is visible. But I thought we'd throw this chart up, Joe, just to put things into context, that what we have here are the year-on-year changes. This is BOABC data that we access, showing that milk processing volumes, it's not demand, it's actually what's being processed, has been rising 4 to 5% in the 4 months to July. So if this is going to change, if stimulus is going to change the market, that number needs to keep rising and be a little stronger, we would suggest, to reduce the manufacturing volumes sufficiently to stimulate more imports. So let's say a further 5% year-on-year gain, that would certainly, offsets where we've seen those big bars going downwards. But 5% year-on-year is equivalent to 1.5 billion yuan per month, every month. If we're going to change the demand side sufficiently to turn that dynamic around. So that's a lot of money to come out. Now, these measures are widespread. Nothing's sort of touching that level at the moment. But again, so the vouchers and these sorts of issues that have been announced, they're temporary. They talk about vouchers in place for a month. A lot of them won't directly impact milk consumption. And at the same time, the support for milk producers, and I'm confused by that because they've just been talking about the need to stabilise and control supply to rebalance. So, yeah, jury's out yet. There's a lot of detail to come out, a lot of detail to access as we'll keep watching this. But just to put it in perspective, it needs to be a lot to make a difference.
Yeah, we certainly saw a response in terms of dairy company stock prices as this announcement was made. But I guess we're all just really, really keen for some good news out of China. So
yeah, we need some.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for watching. That's all for this week. We'll be back again next week in different locations.